lesson that strategy we're gonna do is strategy 6.10, who's telling the story. Okay. So reading, Daisy, it's all about thinking and understanding. Sometimes when I'm reading, I might get to a confusing part that I don't understand. A lot of times it happens when I'm reading a book when there's a lot of different characters and the characters are going back and forth with talking. And it can be hard for me to keep track of who is talking or who is speaking or who the character is. So that is something that is very confusing for me, but it is something that I need to stop and try to fix my understanding, try to make it better. I need to try to not be confused about it. So when we read a story, the narrator is a very important part of that story. Do you know what a narrator is?
The person who reads it, I guess.
Yeah, yep. So it can either be the person who's reading it. It also, like when you're reading aloud in your head, the narrator is the person that's telling the story in the book. They give us information about the characters by describing them. Sometimes, though, the narrator is the character. So that way, then you kind of learn about what the character is thinking and feeling. It's like if you were pretending that you were that person, that character is kind of what happens when a character is narrating. So we are going to read a passage from a book called Horrible Harry in Room 2B. So I'm going to have you read this little passage and then we will work together to see if we can figure out who the narrator is.
Okay. Harry sits next to me in room 2B. He looks like any other second grader except for one thing. Harry loves to do horrible things. When I first met Harry out on the playground, he had a shoebox. I asked him, "What's in there?" "Something." "What's your name?" "Doug."
Good. So the first thing that I noticed from the very first sentence is that Harry cannot be the narrator because Harry cannot sit next to Harry. So it says Harry sits next to me. So Harry can't sit next to himself. So I know that Harry is not the narrator of the book, even though when I read the title, I thought maybe Harry was going to be the narrator. Another key word that I find in the first sentence as well is me. Harry sits next to me. So that lets me think that another character is telling the story. When we go on a couple sentences later, it says, when I first met Harry. So that's another pronoun that lets me think it's another character that's telling the story, not Harry. And then in that last sentence, we figure out who is telling the story, who is telling it. In the last sentence, it tells us his name. Did you click off it?
Yeah.
So
should I read the second part?
So we find out who's narrating the story in the very last sentence. It's the very last word. Doug.
Yep.
So that's who we figure out who's telling the story. But it took us a minute. We didn't know that it was Doug right away. But another thing we learned was that Doug, who's narrating it, he thinks that Harry does horrible things. So when a character is narrating the story, it kind of lets you inside of that character's mind and inside their feelings and what they think. So that's how I know, Doug thinks Harry does horrible things. So we used keywords and we used the dialogue. The dialogue is when two characters are talking to each other. So that's how we figured out who was telling the story. So I'm going to have you read this next little paragraph and see if you can figure out who the narrator is. This paragraph is from the book called The Call of the Wild by Jack London. So you can start reading whenever you have it pulled up and are ready.
Buck was neither house dog nor kennel dog. The whole realm was his. He plunged in a swimming tank or went hunting with the judge's sons. He escorted Molly and Alice, the judge's daughters, on long twilight or early morning rambles. On wintry nights, he lay at the judge's feet before the roaring library fire. He carried the judge's grandsons on his back, or rolled them in grass, and guarded their footsteps through wild adventures down to the fountain in the stable yard, and even beyond, where the paddocks were, and the berry patches.
Good. So can you tell who the narrator is from that? And you can look for some pronouns to give you some clues. If you can see like the words I, him, she, they.
I see.
Yep.
These, and yeah, it's pretty much he and his.
Yes. Good. So when we see pronouns like he, she, they, that means that a character is not telling the story, a narrator is telling it. So in this passage that you read, a narrator is telling us the story, because you're right, it uses a name, Buck, and then it just says the whole realm was his. He plunged into the tank. He escorted Molly and Alice. He lay at the judge's feet. So those pronouns gave us a clue as to who was narrating the story, or who was telling the story. And so, and like when we read the sentence the paragraph that we read earlier about Harry, it was a little different because some of the pronouns it used was when I first met Harry, I asked him. So that's how we knew it was a character, because it was using words like I, my. So it's very important for us when we're reading to know who is telling that story, just so we don't get confused when we are reading. You can always keep a reading journal too, to keep track of characters if you start getting confused. I like to do that sometimes, or just have a notepad next to you when you're reading a book that has a lot of characters, because then you can just write down who is who, or who is narrating the story, and it helps you keep things straight. But it is important to try and fix the problem if you start getting confused right away, and not waiting to fix it, because then you'll just get more confused and the book will not make any sense, and then it will not be very fun to read. So that is how we can figure out who's telling the story. Did you have any questions on how to tell?
Not really.
No. What is a narrator again?
The person who either reads it or person in the story that is telling it.
Yep, you bet. How can you tell if a character is telling the story? What types of pronouns if the character was telling it?
I and me.
I, me, we, my. Good. How about if a narrator was telling it? What types of pronouns?
Them, he, she, him, her.
Yep, you bet. Awesome. So that's just some good knowledge to keep in the back of your head. Um, if you don't have any other questions, that is all that I have for you today.
You have no questions.
All right. Thank you, Daisy.
You're welcome.